Haram has killed thousands of people and kidnapped hundreds of others during its 6-year campaign to carve out an IS-style governorate in northern Nigeria.
Well, joining me to discuss that story is A.O. Johnson, who's a journalist, and Mukky who's a geopolitical analyst from the Nigeria Diaspora Security Forum. Welcome to the programme, both of you. Mukky, is this going to make any difference in the battle against Boko Haram, or is it perhaps more likely that it will spread the conflict into other countries?
I think it depends, because if you look at the force that has been pledged, well, certainly the African Union and United Nations force that has been pledged, 8,700 of them, most analysts tend to sort of like think that it wouldn't really make that much of an impact immediately, because if you look at the geographical area within which they're meant to operate in Borno State, which is the locus of Boko Haram's insurgency, that's, to give you a geographical perspective of it, that's almost half of England, for example. Now, that's obviously a very, very small force to be able to operate in that type of area. But coming much more immediately to the regional force that has been operating currently in Nigeria, that's the Chadian and Nigerian force and Nigerian force, it seems as if they've had a sort of like a significant impact in deterritorializing Boko Haram and taking much of the territory that Boko Haram seized earlier this year and late last year. So for now, I would say it remains to be seen the impacts a regional force would have on the dynamics of Boko Haram and reducing their strength.
A.O. Johnson, welcome to the programme. So Mukky in the studio is saying some initial success, but question marks over whether that can be sustained. What's your view?
Well, the bottom line is that Boko Haram has been receiving quite a battering from Nigerian forces over the last couple of weeks. That's not, and that's the reason why they formed their alliance with IS, because they know that if at all there's going to be a push for them to survive, they need extra money, they need better equipment, they need far more training, and they need a constant supply of jihadists that are willing to come and support their cause. So I think that's the reason why they've gone to ISIL, and of course, in relation to the military operation that's ongoing as we speak between Niger, Cameroon, and the Chadian forces, which are coming from the top, and of course backed by Nigerian forces from the bottom to squeeze Boko Haram. I think that's very much in keeping with the thought process that says clearly to take Boko Haram out now, degrade its ability before it gets the support from IS, which would make it much stronger, before it gets the support from IS, which will give it more ammunition, before it gets the support from IS that would give it ability to be able to last longer than now. So I think the push right now is to make sure that Boko Haram doesn't survive, and ultimately for it to degrade to the fact that even if IS supports it, its capabilities will be very, very weakened.
And are there any fears that if this doesn't work, and we've had false dawns before here, if this doesn't work, that the countries now joining in this battle will simply become targets for what is now an Islamic State affiliate?
Yes, the franchise will continue. We would expect Boko Haram to become far more tough, far more aggressive. We will expect the beheadings that we've seen to be known with IS to happen with Boko Haram. In fact, they've been doing that already. But the question is, can they survive? Can they get enough support pretty quickly from the IS to be able to hold up what is ultimately becoming a very big offensive against them, one that they would otherwise not have wished, because it's coming from all sides. And then compounded with the 7,500 troops which have already been endorsed by the African Union, which I must say are going to be predominantly based in the Chad River Basin area, and of course that will intensify and command some difficulties for Boko Haram. I think Boko Haram is going through a very difficult phase right now, and I'm not sure whether the jihadists and IS would be able to come in time to help the Boko Haram call.
What do you make of that, Mukky? Do you think that they can expect any sort of serious level of support from an affiliation to the Islamic State? I mean, it's a long way from the Islamic State's main field of operations. You can't quite see so many foreign fighters making their way to Boko Haram as you might do, say, in Syria. Do you think that's a plausible expectation on their part?
I think in the short term, in terms of actual material support, in terms of weapons, that's unlikely. But there are two advantages that come with sort of like an ISIS affiliation. Number one is Boko Haram improving its stature in terms of the global jihadist scene. And by that, they'll be able to draw in a lot of the itinerant jihadists who may not be able to make their way to the Levant area. So Boko Haram would probably be able to, get those guys to come over to Nigeria. And the second, much more concrete resource that Boko Haram can draw or would be able to draw from an pledge of allegiance to ISIS would probably be in the sense of technical logistical support from the ISIS group or from the ISIS network. Let's not forget that in January or late January, February, there was a pledge of allegiance from a group in Libya, and that's just a country away from Nigeria. So Boko Haram would probably or should probably be able to tap into that network to get logistical support down to Nigeria. So I think that's probably where we should look at an operational impact of that Pledge of Allegiance.
Okay, and on the other side, with these the new commitment of troops from Chad and from Niger, is that seriously coordinated, or is it simply a declaration of intent? Is there a serious joint military operation going on here?
It's very difficult to tell, but from the signals we're getting from the ground, it seems as if there doesn't seem to be any form of coordination between Nigeria and Niger and Chad. There certainly is some sort of coordination between Niger and Chad and Cameroon, but from the Nigerian side, there doesn't seem to be any sort of coordination there. The reason being is because if you look at the messaging that has been coming out from Nigeria's defense spokesman and the spokesman of the Chadian military and the Nigerian military, there seemed to be a lot of dissonance in their messages. Chad basically saying that it's liberated a lot of these territories single-handedly. The Nigerian military coming out, expressing deep dissatisfaction with the way the Chadians have gone about briefing their PR team. So on that level alone, I think we can conclude that operational synergy between the two sides isn't really as you would expect.
Oh, yeah, is that how you see it? That basically the different countries here are fighting their own conflict, and that the degree of sort of close cooperation, command cooperation, isn't really there?
Well, not exactly. I think we're far removed from that. That may have been protocol 6 months ago, but we are now at an era where, for example, Chadian and Niger forces have, their soldiers have the ability, and they're showing so right now, to be able to go into Nigerian territory. That was unheard of in the past before. And that calls for greater cooperation for that activity to take place, for Nigerians to feel comfortable for other military to come into their own country and fight a jihadist war. I think clearly they're working in tandem. The degree of that tandemness will be determined by the successes or failures on the battlefield, which we're witnessing right now, and only time will tell. But from the illustrations that we're seeing on the ground, clearly shows a Nigerian force that's capable. We're seeing a Chadian force that's stepped up. We're seeing Niger coming into the battle. We're seeing Cameroonian troops that are very active. And besides, the African Union has already pledged this 7,500 troops, which are going to be based in the Chadian basin. So ultimately, if you look at the map, you can see that Boko Haram has nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They're coming from all sides and squeezing the life out of them.
Mukky, I mean, part of the problem here has always been the sort of degree of incompetence on the Nigerian government's part, and corruption and so forth and so on. Can there be a military solution to Boko Haram without significant political change in the central government?
Definitely not. The major problem of Boko Haram is a situation of governance. If you look at where these sorts of groups tend to operate, is in a situation where either the state has collapsed or governance is very, very weak and poor. And Boko Haram themselves started as a sort of like a protest group, a group that was protesting against misgovernance, corruption. I mean, that is the central core of their message. Western institutions have failed, so therefore Islam, or their own particular brand of Islam, is the answer. So the military solution, or the military component of defeating Boko Haram, is definitely very, very important. You need to deterritorialize the group. You need to put pressure on the group. But once the group has been deterritorialized, the next thing you need to do is the socio-economic aspect, in terms of regenerating and rebuilding the areas that have been destroyed, in terms of providing services to the people of those areas that live in the conflict zone. But also in terms of corruption. If you look at the military, the reason why the military has performed so poorly, at least up until this past couple of weeks, is because the budgets that has been budgeted to the military, much of it tends to disappear into corruption. So obviously corruption is a major aspect of why the military, and certainly state institutions themselves, have not been able to react to the Boko Haram threat. Now, going back to what Ayo said, I mean, I'll disagree slightly in terms of the synergy that exists between Nigerian troops and Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. You just have to listen to what the spokesman of the two sides say. I mean, and there's very strong dissonance coming from the two sides. Now, clearly, you wouldn't have that type of situation where military cooperation or strong synergy at the command level exists.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave that discussion there, but I'm sure we'll be returning to it in the future. But do stay with us for the second part of the show, where we'll be taking a look at the rest of